This week in wrestling history, 20 years ago this week was, without exaggeration, the most historic week in wrestling history, the death of WCW. The death of WCW is the worst thing to ever happen in wrestling history. As bad as WCW was in those final years, WWE needed the competition. If we've learned anything in the years since, WWE needed it. It thrived on that competition. And when WCW went away, so too did a lot of its fans, never to return. WWE spent many years trying to get those lapsed fans to come back, and many of them never did. When WCW died, Vince McMahon no longer had anybody to fight with. There was no more Ted Turner. Ted Turner was the evil boogeyman who would break out his checkbook. Oh, he's the evil billionaire. It's funny how times change and the shoe ends up on the other foot. But there was no more Ted Turner as the big evil supervillain. There was no more Eric Bischoff. Vince McMahon was at his best when his back was against the wall and he was forced to make changes. Today, with billions of dollars in guaranteed TV money, there's no incentive for him to change, even when the product is so bad. This week marked 20 years since WWE bought World Championship Wrestling and TNT aired the final edition of Monday Nitro, a series of events that unfolded over the course of one very important week in history. So I figured I would just cover the entire thing up front and then get into all of the other events this week in history after that, and there was a lot more, but this is easily the most significant of the events that took place this week. Now, last week, I talked about Brad Siegel, president of Turner Programming, sending a memo around announcing a hiatus for WCW programming that turned out to not be an actual hiatus at all, and Jamie Kellner, the new Turner CEO at that time, canceling all wrestling programming on TNT and TBS, which killed the planned sale of the company to Fusion Media Ventures and Eric Bischoff, who were partnered up for this deal. That deal had been announced only 2 months, January of 2001, so only 2 months earlier. They went public, they jumped the gun, and announced their intent to buy WCW. Now, there was a last-ditch effort to salvage the deal even after Kellner killed the TV slots. There was a last-minute effort to find a new TV partner. I mean, after all, pro wrestling at that time, even though WCW was past its peak of popularity, it was already on a big downswing. And even WWE by that point, to a degree. I mean, the television ratings had cooled off from the peak period where it was pulling in 6s and 6.5 and 7s every single week. But wrestling itself, WWE was still, very popular at that point. And they weren't that far removed from the peak. They were only maybe a couple of years removed from the peak where both shows were combining on a routine basis every Monday night for 9, 10, 11 million viewers on cable. So it would have been impossible to believe that no network would have jumped at the chance to have wrestling on their channel. But when Fusion scrambled to find a new TV deal, they were met with rejection everywhere they turned. USA Network wanted nothing to do with wrestling anymore. WWE had already jumped over to TNN the year before. And when they tried to make a deal with Fox to bring WCW to the FX network, those talks failed. And when they failed, so too did Fusion's bid to buy the company, because without TV, WCW was worthless to them. Had no value. On March 23rd, 2001, WWE issued the following press release. World Wrestling Federation Entertainment Today announced its purchase of World Championship Wrestling from Turner Broadcasting System, a division of AOL Time Warner. The purchase of WCW creates a tag team partnership with the World Wrestling Federation brand that is expected to propel the sports entertainment genre to new heights. In keeping with the company's strategic alliance with Viacom, new WCW programming is anticipated to air on TNN in the near future. The possibility of cross-brand storylines and intrigue, however, may start as early as Monday night during WWF Raw is War on TNN and the final performance of WCW Monday Nitro live on TNT. The binding agreement provides WWE with the global rights to the WCW brand, tape library, and other intellectual property rights. The acquisition of the WCW brand is a strategic move for us, said Stuart Snyder, president and COO of WWE at that time. We are assuming a brand with global distribution and recognition. We are adding thousands of hours to our tape library that can be repurposed for home videos, TV, internet streaming, and broadband applications. The WCW, did Bret Hart change his name to Stuart Snyder here in this instance? The WCW opens new opportunities for growth in our pay-per-view, live events, and consumer products divisions, as well as the opportunity to develop new TV programming using new stars. We will also create additional advertising and sponsorship opportunities. In short, it is a perfect fit. There have been different figures thrown around as to exactly what WWE paid for WCW. I believe it was $2.5 million plus money for the tape library above and beyond that. Might have been like $1.7 million. I think it was $1.7 million. Diamond Dallas Page, I don't remember where he gave this quote, but he had given a quote many years ago saying that they got the tape library for $1.7 million, which is, I mean, that's a steal. And had he known that it would have only cost $1.7 million to buy the tape library, he says he would have bought it himself. I mean, that is a ridiculously low figure when you consider the amount of history that is part of that tape library and the ways in which WWE has been able to monetize it over the years, not just in terms of the network, which has now been sold for billions of dollars to Peacock, but in terms of DVDs and other ways that they've made money off that library. So you hear these figures, $2.5 million, $1.7 million, it's crazy. You throw in lawyer fees, and the total that they paid ultimately is probably closer to $5 or $6 million, which is still unbelievably low. For a company that at one time, not too long before all of this, was worth a hell of a lot more than that. It was basically a fire sale. This is a company in WCW that generated $30 million in profits in 1998. They remained profitable through the first half of 1999, and then they ended the year with $9 million in losses. And in the year 2000, the company ended the year with $62 million in losses. In the span of 2 years, they went from $30 million in profit to $62 million in losses. And that's only because they cut costs. Otherwise, it would have been closer to $80 million in losses. That is simply astounding how fast the fall really was. You know, Rome wasn't built in a day, but it burned in one. But as you heard in that press release, the plan was to relaunch WCW with its own show on TNN, but even though WWE was already on the network, they already had the relationship with Viacom, they could not get a good time slot for it. I think TNN, they didn't want to be branded the wrestling channel and just put all their wrestling programming in their prime slots, so they didn't get a good time slot for the show. It was going to air on Saturday nights from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. Jim Ross talked in his Ross Report at the time about a possible start date sometime in mid-June. They even had certain venues already booked out a few months in advance. Jim Ross and Kevin Dunn were two of the point people responsible for trying to put everything together. Talent roster, front office staff, other logistics. The early idea was for it to just be a TV show initially, no pay-per-views, no house shows, at least not until, maybe later in the year. There would be no WCW stars on any of the WWE shows, but there would be some WWE names showing up on WCW because WWE hadn't signed very many big names. Really just Booker T and DDP. Otherwise, it was largely middle-of-the-card talent, so they would want some big WWE names on the show, which I can understand why they would, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't have, in terms of ratings and wanting to generate interest in the shows. But you can see how that would have, right out of the gate, immediately made WCW feel second rate, which is not what you want to do when you're trying to relaunch and establish a new brand. Right out of the gate, it already feels second rate, right? It already feels less than, which is, I think, what would have happened had they done that. But they didn't have the big names. The big names were sitting at home collecting the money they had left on their Turner contracts. Guaranteed money to sit at home and do nothing. Bill Goldberg said, "I sat out and made my money." What kind of moron would go to work for half the amount of money when they could sit at home and collect what's written in a contract? You know what? He's not wrong. Goldberg is not wrong. March 26th was the famous Raw Nitro simulcast, with Raw airing live from Cleveland, Ohio, and the final Nitro airing from Panama City Beach. For spring break, they passed out flyers at the event to all the party goers to get them to attend the show. They were promoting a Nitro party package with 5+ hours of all-you-can-drink beer. WWE requested the Nitro script the night before, ended up changing almost all of the matches and segments. So overnight, almost everything that was planned on that show, WWE came in and changed, except for one very important thing that they kept as is, which was the planned main event. The planned main event was going to be Sting, one last time, one-on-one against the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. Although it turned out to not be their final match, their final match was not on that final Nitro. Sting and Flair ended up having their final match 10 years later on an episode of Impact Wrestling. But both shows opened that night with Vince McMahon. So imagine if you're a WCW fan putting on TNT, the first thing you see, the first face that you see on your television screen when you put on WCW is Vince McMahon. And he is standing there talking about how he held the fate of WCW in his hands. Booker T beat Scott Steiner to win the WCW World Heavyweight title, ending the company both as its world champion and the United States champion. So Booker T had all the hardware. He had all the gold at the very end of WCW. And Sting beat Flair in the main event. Then we had another simulcast portion of the show at the very end. Just when Vince McMahon thought that he had bested his biggest competition, Shane McMahon appeared in the ring in Panama City Beach on Nitro, much to Vince's surprise, and made the announcement that the contract did say McMahon, but the name on the contract was Shane McMahon, announcing that he now owned WCW. And the final Nitro closed with, of all things, a promo hyping Stone Cold against The Rock at WrestleMania X7. Ric Flair cut a passionate promo at the beginning of that same show, rebutting many of Vince McMahon's comments at the top of the show and, serving as this great defender of WCW, but that's all it was. It was all an act. It was all, a promo. It was nothing more. Flair felt the exact opposite in real life, and he was actually relieved that it was the end. He was relieved to see the end come for WCW, knowing finally that it was over. He said, "I felt glad. We should have closed down a year before. We had turned into such a mockery. We had become the laughing stock. The guys in WWE were just laughing at us. It was an embarrassing nightmare for anyone that had ever become successful in our business. It was terrible. I was emotionally upset for the people who had worked there for years, like the production people and the wrestlers losing their jobs. When there are two entities and it becomes one, the marketplace becomes a lot smaller. Everybody got a month of severance pay for each year they had been there, so a guy who had been there for 10 years would only get paid for a year in severance. 150 people went out of business in one day. Some of them made it, some of them didn't. Nobody gave a shit. It was pretty sad and very insensitive." I would recommend that everybody read the Guy Evans book called Nitro. It's It's called Nitro, The Incredible Rise and Inevitable Collapse of Ted Turner's WCW. It's over 550 pages long, but it is the definitive book when it comes to all things WCW, from the rise and fall and how it happened, why it happened. Interviews with anybody and everybody that you can think of, whoever worked for the company, the people behind the scenes, interviewed Turner executives. It is the best book. The best, most accurate book. The numbers and figures are all in there, contract stuff. So if you're really interested in the very minute details of what happened and a lot of the names involved and key players, again, I can't recommend that book enough. But to put a bow on this once and for all, that head-to-head period between WWE and WCW was the most fun that I have ever had in 34, almost 35 years now as a wrestling fan. From the first time that I can remember watching it, Monday nights, it was appointment television. You never knew what you were going to see, who might show up on the other show. And when I talk about the fact that it's not the same way today, there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, the biggest reason is the lack of competition. Yes, there's AEW, there's Impact, there's a ton of wrestling promotions out there, but there is no one-to-one competitor. AEW would be the closest thing, and even there, it's not an apples-to-apples thing. That one-to-one competitor who can really give WWE a run for its money, or would go head-to-head with the company on television in the same night, who had a lot of the same history already built in, right? WCW, the history of the promotion, you can trace it back many, many years, just like WWE has decades of history under its belt. A lot of the companies today don't have that. But it's not just about that. It's not just about creative and how good it was or bad it is, or any of that, type of stuff. That head-to-head period between those two companies, when I say it was appointment television, even technology now is just very different. Even the shows that I like, a lot of the time I won't bother watching them live because I know that I could just turn around later on in the night, the next day, the day after that, and bring it up on my computer, bring it up on my phone, DVR, what have you, and just play catch up with it, right? It's just a very different world now than it was 22, 25 years ago. So you can never go back to those days. You can never replicate that period, popping a VHS tape in your VCR. So you could at least try to record one show and you'll catch up with it later. It's just very different. But it was so much fun because you never knew what you were going to find when those two shows were at their peak of them being the most entertaining and the most enjoyable that they were. You also never knew who was going to show up from one week to the next. People were jumping ship left and right. Big names, too. The internet, the internet was there. RSPW was there. Social media wasn't. You didn't have Twitter. You didn't have Facebook. You didn't have the sort of instant way of communication amongst other fans that you have today. So information got to you a little bit slower than it would today, where things are just news breaks and everybody knows within 3 minutes. It was an exciting time. It was an exciting time to be a fan. You look forward to going home that night at the end of if it was a work day, a school day, whatever it was, and putting on the TV and flipping back and forth, between the two shows to see what was going on. WCW took the formula of mostly squash matches. Even up to 95, Raw was, you had a lot of enhancement type matches, and maybe you had that one big feature match on the show, that one big main event every week. WCW and Eric Bischoff, they took that formula and they just turned it on its head. They turned it upside down. They took Nitro. And really what they did was they hot-shotted a lot of big matches. And hot-shotting will work from time to time. I would not advocate hot-shotting every week, which is what we see today a lot of times, because you burn people out on your big matches and then you have nothing left other than rematches. So there's good and bad to it. But Bischoff took this formula with Nitro and made it, a big event every single week with big names. And when WCW died, WWE had a chance to do something really special in terms of the invasion, just creatively, what they could have done that eventually would build to some kind of a big super card or a big WrestleMania card with interpromotional matches and stuff. They had an opportunity to do that and they bungled it in spectacular fashion. But not before WCW bungled itself. It never should have happened, and wrestling has never been the same.